find some space here. Dan Zarlinga is with the Missouri Department of Conservation, the Greater St. Louis Area Media Specialist for the the Missouri Department of Conservation. Dan, why don't you grab a seat here? You are the man of the hour because news broke, I guess, the last couple of days that you guys decided to try and remove the Asian carp from Creve Coeur Lake, and this story is fascinating, so thanks for joining us.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Let's talk. How bad is the problem of Asian carp in Creve Coeur Lake?
Pretty bad, actually. They entered the lake in a number of flooding events that have occurred in the last few years since, 2009 or so.
Right.
And so there's an enormous population in Creve Coeur Lake. We're guessing somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000. That could be conservative. And the problem is they are extremely competitive, and they're out-competing the native fish that we already have in there, the fish we like to see. And as a result, the fishery's gone really down. If you talk to people who fish in Creve Coeur Lake, it's like, why bother anymore?
Do you stock Creve Coeur Lake with regular fish or other fish or trout or whatever else?
Not in that particular lake that we don't, but there is should be a natural fishery there.
What type of fish would we find in Creve Coeur Lake?
Typical lake fish like some bass and bluegill and things of that nature. So, it should be a really good, it's one of the natural lakes in our area. Actually, It's not a man-made lake, so it should be pretty good for fishing. But unfortunately, because of the Asian carp, it's not. And then as anyone who's ever taken a kayak out there or a rowing team or whatever can attest to, they're jumping all over the place. And, these fish do that, and they can possibly hit you, get in your boat. And then they're oftentimes a source of some pretty nasty fish kills. So when they have a big die-off sometimes, and certain times in the summer when the oxygen levels drop and the fish get stressed. And that's somewhat natural, but the fact that they're all in there and they don't do well in those conditions and die in big numbers.
So then you have a whole bunch of fish floating on top.
Right, and you don't even have to see them to know they're there. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so you guys decided to try and thin the herd, if you will.
Well, we're hoping to do more than thin the herd. We're hoping to virtually eliminate them from Creve Coeur Lake.
How would you do that?
Well, what we're doing, there's been some other things tried in the past that haven't been too successful, but this is the method we're using is termed the unified method, but it's an experimental method that's only been done a couple of times, I believe once in China and once in Illinois, to try to get rid of Asian carp in an impoundment, in a lake situation. And what it involves is a combination of, I guess what you'd call fish herding, fish corralling. We are taking boats and utilizing sound and utilizing other means to try to drive the fish out of portions of the lake. So like we start in the outer portions of the lake to drive them out of those areas because they respond negatively to sound. They get pushed farther. Okay. You can push them along. Electricity is another method we're using to try to stimulate them and move them. And so we start in the outer peripheries of the lake and some of the wetland areas and all that to get them out of there. That was the first day's work. And then after that, we're working on the body of the lake to gradually move them. And as we move them from one section, we put down really large nets, which prevent them from going back into the lake portions of the lake that's been cleared. So it's a very methodical process. You work a certain area, clear the fish with these methods, with sonic and electricity, and then you put nets in to keep them from going back in, and then you go to the next section, clear that section, put a net, next section, et cetera, et cetera. So
how long does that take?
Well, we're estimating that it'll take about a week, and once we progressively get them into smaller and smaller portions of the lake. So once we get them in about a week's time, we'll have them concentrated into a relatively small area, and this happens to be around Sailboat Cove. And so they're going to be concentrated in that area. Then that will facilitate the second, that's going to be a 2-week procedure approximately. So the second week, we are going to be concentrating on removing the fish. So we're naturally going to get some native fish here too. Mm-hmm. So that'll be a sorting process. We'll have to literally go through all the fish, sort what's native, what's Asian carp. The native fish will return back to the lake, and then the Asian carp will get rid of.
If the Asian carp can jump into the boat, can't they jump over the net?
Well, they're placing them such to make them less able to do that. And the other thing is our choice of the time of year. In the winter, the fish are less active and they're more sluggish and more lethargic. So they're less inclined to jump and escape. The other thing that this process, I think, relies on is keeping them constantly on the move and keeping them disoriented. So one of the things that our biologists are concerned about is what they don't want to do is do this herding process and then have to stop in the middle for a couple of days or something like that, hypothetically.
Right.
Because then they'll say that 2 or 3 days, the fish may find ways to get around the nets and get out. But as long as you keep them moving, they just don't have a chance to do that.
What are you going to do with the fish once you get them out?
Well, the thing, we're going to end up with so many fish. We may have 50,000 fish or something, so we don't really have a means to process all those fish. And also, this is something that's relatively new, so we haven't accounted for it in the wildlife code yet as far as a way to utilize the fish. But we are working on some ways in the future that we can, utilize the fish for some kind of use, and that may involve outside processors or something like that. That's beyond what we can do.
Now, Asian carp originally is not native to America, right? This is a science experiment gone very wrong, isn't it?
More or less, yeah. They were brought in years ago for aquaculture purposes, and just like they've gotten into Creve Coeur Lake through flooding, they got out through flooding. And one thing folks have to realize is all of our waterways are interconnected.
Right.
And so there's no such thing as, it's just what happens here doesn't affect anywhere else, because it does. And so you have a flooding event like we've seen several of in the last few years, and those fish get out. And they've gotten into the main river systems, and this method, unfortunately, won't apply to a river system. It's just mainly to clear them from lakes.
It's not a delicacy. It's not a food, right? There's no.
Can you eat it?
There's no specialty in the restaurant for Asian carp.
Well, I mean, you can eat them. They're edible fish, and I'm not a fish preparation expert, but as I understand, there's a vein of red meat that you need to be sure and get out of there when you fillet them, because that can leave a bad taste. But the actual white portion of the fish is pretty good, and so it's totally edible. I think a lot of it is probably public perception. They perceive them as, they're dirty, nasty fish, but actually you can eat them. In fact, there's some of our folks down in our southeast portion of the state who work on the big rivers a lot are very evangelistic about trying to make people aware that you can eat them.
Right.
And they've done some blind taste tests comparing them with Asian carp, tilapia, and I think catfish. And in the blind taste test, they did very well. In fact, they were the most popular fish.
Did you ever think about saying, like, hey, come one, come all, let's try and fish them, let's just overfish the Asian carp? Or is that just not?
Well, that would be really tough to do, because there's just so many in there. It would be so hard to do.
Can you fish for them?
Well, they're technically not a game fish, so technically no, exactly. They like they jump in your boat or something. That's one thing.
Right.
And to try to fish them out would actually be. It's not. Let's just go for a day of fishing, grab a couple fish.
Right.
You'd have to spend 10 hours a day exhaustively fishing, and just throwing lines in isn't going to do it.
Gotcha.
It needs to be more of an industrial removal, so to speak.
So when are you starting this process?
Well, we actually started it Monday. So that was the first. Monday we spent clearing the outer portions, those some of those other areas. Tuesday we started on the body of the lake, and then we're proceeding on.
How's it going?
So far, pretty good. I mean, it seems to be going pretty good. And we've been lucky with weather. That was our one big concern, of course, this time of year, because cold is actually kind of good for this process, but you don't want frozen water. And so, like, we had planned to do it a couple weeks ago when the lake was frozen, we wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah.
So,
any other lakes thinking about getting this treatment?
Well, not immediately planning on doing it, but so far in the past, they've reached about 60 to 70% removal, and so we've tweaked it. We've learned some things from that, so we're shooting for 90% this time. That doesn't mean we're deliberately leaving 10% in, but it's just you realize you're not going to get them all, but we're hoping to get 90%.
But you'll have to do this again at some point, because it's a very invasive fish, right?
Well, only if there's a flooding event and more get in there. So that's the second flip side of this, is we also have to investigate ways to prevent that from happening, and that part is still experimental, and that will require some additional funding and all, but if this is successful and we learn from this could be a model for using it even nationally, because we're partnering with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS on this project.
Even though you leave 10%, or there's going to be some fish left in the lake, you're saying they're not going to eventually reproduce to where they're as popular or as populated as it is now?
No, because they don't reproduce very well in still water. They're mostly a river fish, and they reproduce well in moving water, but not so much still water. So the problem is there's just so many, and they live a long time, and they outcompete the other fish. But if you knock 90% of them out, there's not going to be very many left anymore. And then it'll take maybe 2 or 3 years for the native fishery to reestablish itself in the lake.
There's no other fish that can actually
there's
outsmart them.
There's no predator.
No, they don't really have any major predators.
So they're the top of the fish chain.
And they're just and they're very adaptable to these waters. They don't reproduce well in the lakes, but they're adaptable other than that. So they're just it's just a classic example of taking something from one place and putting it into another where it doesn't belong and having issues.
There you go. All right, that is Dan Zarlinga, Greater St. Louis Area Media Specialist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. You work for the state, right?
I do, yes.
Yeah, but you're based here in St. Louis.
I am based in St. Louis, yes.
Will you come back and tell us how the event went?
I absolutely will.
It's really interesting stuff. All right, maybe you'll take care of the deer in Town and Country next.
Well, that's our next thing. We'll have to do something a little different for that, I suspect.